From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our reading room, the African and Middle East Reading Room. I'm Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the Division, and I'm delighted that you could be here with us and for this special talk with Professor Stephen King at Georgetown University. Before I start, we want to point out to you that this program is taking place in the context of the Library of Congress's collections. So it is in a way, part of the collections. It's going to become part of the archives of the collections. And all our programs in this division, other divisions, complement the collections that we hold. So this division is responsible for 78 countries around the world, in Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. And we collect, we recommend, we collect, we store collections which come to us from our offices in Cairo, in Nairobi, in Islamabad. Those three offices actually send us materials. They purchase the materials, they catalog those materials, and they send them to us. And we keep them in the stacks, closed stacks right here, and then we serve them to researchers. This is one part of our activities. The other part, of course, is because we are the public face of the library, is to interact with the researchers and the patrons, to serve them. We are public servants. So we serve them the collections, we're experts in our fields, and this division has 21 experts, and we know the languages, the cultures, the sources that we have, and we invite experts who are outside of this institution to come and to share with us their research work, their thoughts on the new trends in the fields of African and Middle Eastern studies. We are, in a way, a focus of interaction between patrons and between those who serve the collections. We are also, we show films. We have displays and exhibits. And we invite scholars to bring their students, if they can, to the library as well. We've moved from up to the 18-year-old, we're going down to 15 and 16-year-old. Younger than that, they should be accompanied by their parents. But anyway, I want to put today's lecture in quick focus in terms of the library's collection on Tunisia. Some of you have already seen them. Now, this doesn't work quite that way. I was hoping it would, but anyway. Okay, so this is the room where you're in. This is where we serve you with the collections. We have reference sources for the generalist. We also have works on archaeology. We have ancient manuscripts. We have old maps. Those are found in various parts of the library. We have prints and photographs on Tunisia, which includes the ones you've seen and these. We have collections of vintage posters. We have travel books on Tunisia, World War II maps. We have a veterans project that includes veterans speaking about their times in Tunisia. We have papers such as the Roosevelt Papers, manuscripts in the manuscript division. Here is Stephen King's book and members of others who are there as well. We have newspapers and journals. We have a website of archives taken from Tunisia at the time when it was during the Jasmine Revolution. So these are very specialized. We have videos. The law library has materials as well on laws. We have literary works, language dictionaries and materials on linguistics, arts and crafts, even cookbooks, and definitely we have programs such as this one, and this is an example of a program that took place on Tunisia. Now, we also partner with associations that work on the countries and regions of our interests. And today's program is co-sponsored. We work together with the American Tunisian Association. And many people today in this room are members of the American Tunisian Association. I'm saying this because we're being webcast. And the webcast appear on the library's webpage eventually. It takes a little time. We move slowly but surely. But eventually, you'll all be able to see this program, and this program can be seen in every part of the world. And we've realized through our social media that a lot of people actually do watch our programs and do check in. Anchi Ho, who's in our division, has put together a Facebook page as well as organized blogs, not only for this division, but for all the area studies. And I know she has distributed some forms to you, so we'd be happy if you like us on Facebook and on the blogs. If you subscribe to it, it's free. You just click and subscribe. And if you become our friends, because if you do, then you'll be aware of all the programs that we're getting, because part of the things we put up is a calendar of our events. And the calendar of our events is an open invitation for you all to come and attend our many programs. So again, thank you for coming. And now I would like to introduce our speaker today. After this long introduction of mine, but anyway. Stephen King is Associate Professor of Politics in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. He received a BA with honors in English and an MA in African politics from the University of Florida. And he received an MA in politics and Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University, where he also got his doctorate in politics. Professor King is a comparativist who has focused in his work on the Middle East and North Africa. He's the author of Liberalization Against Democracy, The Local Politics of Economic Reform in Tunisia, published by Indiana University Press in 2003, and The New Authoritarianism in the Middle East and North Africa, also published by Indiana University Press in 2010. He teaches comparative politics, the politics of North Africa, authoritarianism in comparative perspective, the Middle East in comparative perspective, and politics of the Third World. After obtaining his PhD in politics from Princeton, he taught at the university level in various institutions, including Georgetown University before he became associate professor. He also taught in Morocco, completed a Fulbright stint in Tunisia, was a visiting scholar at Woodrow Wilson Center for International Center for Scholars. And in addition to his 2 books mentioned above, he has written numerous articles and book chapters on development in the Middle East and North Africa. His theoretical concerns, the theoretical concerns of his research, have focused on the links between economic liberalization and political change. And he has challenged many of the assumptions that we hold. So without any further ado, let me introduce Professor King.
Thank you, Mary Jane, for inviting me, and I'm happy to see the audience here and the broader world on this webcast. Mary Jane, can you remind me on the final title we decided on for this topic?
It was the challenge.
Well, the economic transition that Tunisia deserves. Yes, the economic transition that Tunisia's democratic transition deserves. As you can tell from the introduction, I'm interested in Tunisia, and I've spent some time there. Now, my general research interest, in layman's terms, is that I'm interested in the politics of the switch from Arab socialism or from socialism to capitalism. And by politics, I mean in the way that Harold Lasswell defined it. Who gets what, when, and how. And the switch from Arab socialism to capitalism within the literature is usually grouped under the political economy of development. And it largely begins with the economic development strategies of these countries. And common to most of the developing world, the Arab world, Tunisia included, made a transition from Arab socialism, which meant in practice state-owned enterprises, land reform, a new social contract to provide basic food and fuel and housing, education, a new social contract after independence for development. The second strategy is the strategy that's been implemented over the last 2 to 3 decades. It's usually called the Washington Consensus. And clearly, it's a switch to policies that are based on market reforms, market forces, privatization, capitalism broadly said. And this Washington Consensus set of policies have been advocated by the World Bank and IMF since about the 80s, I suppose. And connected to the loans that they provide developing countries, there are these recommendations to implement the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus, generally, it has 10 policies. And I won't talk about them all. But the advice is in 2 areas. One is in stabilization of the economy. And for stabilization of the economy, they advise that countries slow down inflation through fiscal discipline and improving the financial position of the state. Now, the one policy I want to focus on is budget cuts to improve the financial position of the state. Arab socialism or that phase of the development strategies included outlays by the state to pay for the subsidies and fuel and education and so forth. So the advice is to cut those and engage in fiscal discipline. You know, people talk about austerity policies, these recessionary austerity policies. And when our countries began doing these, there was a reaction in the countries. the cuts in subsidies were politically explosive, or bred riots across the region. Can't remember what year they occurred in Tunisia, but they occurred in Morocco, Tunisia, across North Africa and much of the Arab world. These riots against the subsidy cuts. The other group of policies are under the label of structural adjustment. And the ones I want to focus on are free trade, freeing prices, privatization of state-owned enterprises and land. Okay. And I want to highlight under privatization, as privatization of state-owned enterprises and also privatization of land. And the World Bank and IMF argue that the privatization should benefit small landowners. And why do they say that? There's a belief that small farm size, family-owned farms especially, they limit the supervision costs of managing wage labor and enforcing effort. You can get more effort. You don't have to supervise your family. They'll work hard. And generally, the small farms tend to be the most productive. Large landowners can be absentee or prestige landowners and not use the land productively. There's a danger of overproduction in large farms. And within the Washington Consensus, this privatization of land, this land reform, is usually suggested as a counter to the charge that structural adjustment, that the Washington Consensus hurts the poor. They argue that the poor will be helped with the land privatization to these small family farms. So, going to Tunisia and Tobrova, I'm interested in these issues because of this switch to the Washington Consensus and the politics of that switch. And Tunisia gave me an opportunity to do research about this, and I decided that there's less research on the local level on land privatization. And I won't stay in the capital. I won't look at state-owned enterprises. I'll look at the local level. And so I found a research site, Tobrova, those of you know Tunisia. And the timing was the 1990s when the end stages of Arab socialism in Tunisia were coming about. They were privatizing the agricultural cooperatives put in place by Ben Salah. So I got a chance to be there on the ground while they were doing that. So I was there for a year, and they were going through this process. And to research the politics as who gets what, when, where, and how, I mean, with the Washington Consensus, the expectation is that, family farms, small landowners, the poor will benefit, the society will benefit because there will be greater productivity and efficiency. Farming will be, as we move into a more market-oriented economy, resources will be allocated more efficiently. Taking the state out of the economy will stop corruption and all of these benefits. So I go, and they're privatizing these farms in my area. I went to 4 or 5 villages around there. And the first step when I got there was, okay, I need to know land tenure as it stands now and what the plans are for this privatization. So I go to the local officials there, and I ask if I could see land tenure information, who owns what. And that one question ended my research. The delegate said, tomorrow you go see the governor. And they revoked, I was on a Fulbright, and they revoked my research clearance. So I went back Tunis, and it took about 6 weeks to get it back. And we got it back because someone because someone working for Fulbright, a Tunisian working for Fulbright, used his connections to get my research clearance back. Okay, so I go, and I know that people are worried about land, the authorities are worried about land tenure information. And I eventually got it in various ways. I think the biggest, it was on some wall in a local official's office, and he stepped out and I was writing everything down as much as I could. But anyway, gradually I got an idea, and the overall story was the land reform was upward. It went to large landowners. It went to the best connected local people politically. Right? And so I designed a research, I made a research design where I would interview people from different large landowners, small, medium, local officials. I was interviewing everyone about these issues. And I'd like to read a few of the passages from these interviews with these different economic categories in Toborba while they were undergoing land reform. Just 1 through 3. Okay, this was a poor peasant. The workers have become beggars. The sun shines on everyone. Normally, the state looks after us all. Why give the land to the rich? They already have land. If you give them more, they will no longer think of the poor. What are they going to do with more? Buy another car? It's no good. You find people with 1,000 hectares while others won't even have 1 hectare. The poor wanted land. Some farmers before got land, and they're doing well. But if you have connections, that's the only way you can get land. Those who are fired like me, we go to the administration asking for work and tell them, you fired us, so give me something to buy bread. Nothing happens. Another one, the poor will always stay poor around here. The poor like grain and grass for the animals. The rich won't allow them to graze on their land. Before you could, now you can't. If there's assistance from the state, the Umdal will give 50% of it to the people, and the rest he'll keep for himself and his friends. It goes on like this in addition to the anger at how the land was privatized. There was anger about the state pulling out and about landowners no longer contributing as much as they did before to a moral economy. They're getting the land, and the moral economy in that area was about, for the poorest, getting enough resources to last through the year, and part of the way they got it was the gifts of the rich during Islamic holidays in that harvest time. And that was part of how they managed their budget. So there was a pressure trying to encourage them to do it, criticizing them for not doing it. And the wealthy that I talked to said, yeah, now we don't do that anymore. You know, we're a modern society. The state does that. We don't have to do that. So there was that tension of, should they help the poor in this time when they're getting great benefits from the state? And through my interviews with the wealthier and with the government people, I got the impression that the state was pushing these landowners to do more, give more in terms of this at the Islamic holidays during harvest. And it was like an offset for, okay, we gave you this land, now you have to do this. And that's how they privatized the land from the Bin Salah cooperatives. So what did I take from that? I took a few things. obviously, the land reform was upwards. That meant, crucially, that what's behind the banner of the switch to capitalism and market forces and privatization in the Washington Consensus is different. What's behind that banner? What's behind that banner was the powerful taking advantage of privatization. Behind that banner, somewhat pushing producers toward an old moral economy instead of the rational actor, productive people that the policies are supposed to trigger, it's supposed to support. Okay, so that was my dissertation and first book went along those lines. Later, when I did research, the research area was about regime change. And the literature, this is, 10 years ago, I suppose, when I started this. The big debate, this is pre-Arab Spring, was about authoritarian persistence and for regional scholars. And I was looking at that, and we were trying to explain why this persistence of authoritarianism in our region, what can be done to democratize the region, research along those lines. And my thought was, it doesn't look like we're moving towards democratization, but there's a lot of change. Remembering what happened in Tunisia, in Toborba, I was thinking there were great changes in economic policies, asset distribution, and that's within authoritarianism. So my next research was about change within authoritarianism. And so the analytical framework I developed was to look at change in regime change by looking at 4 areas. One, what are the policies? And the policies, again, are privatization, free trade, land reform. Land reform upward. What are the basic policies? What's the ruling coalition? Okay. What are the political institutional changes? And what are the changes in terms of legitimacy? And so basically, if we're going from the Arab socialism paradigm to this capitalist paradigm, the new policies are the Washington Consensus policies. We talked about that one. The ruling coalition at the local level, I figured out, were large landowners. At the national level, in which state-owned enterprise, I figured out through the research that it was the same. The assets were going to the wealthiest and the best and politically connected. They became the new ruling coalition. Arab socialism is more of a populist coalition. This has become a ruling coalition for favoring the wealthy. Institutional change, a facade of multi-party politics, went along with this switch to capitalism. And finally, with legitimacy, you get some legitimacy from fake elections. And the other piece is how much repression is necessary to make this regime change in these 4 areas. And so in that research, I found a similar thing as I found in Toborba. The most powerful were getting great advantages from that change. They were taking these advantages and they were aided by a Washington Consensus set of policies that said the economy will grow, you'll end corruption, all of these benefits for the switch. So, is that what I found? No. What I found was more of a crony capitalist form of authoritarian rule is what emerged. And you know, it's on the ground. What did you see? We saw a small ruling clique and patronage networks that were dominating the economy. They used security institutions and the police and the judiciary to maintain power within this small ruling clique. And now that study went beyond Tunisia. It looked basically at the Arab republics, Tunisia, Egypt, Algeria, and Syria. And there was an economist who worked, there were the Arab Human Development Reports. There were a group of Arab economists working on that, and got to know Nader Ferghani, and he was the head of that, I believe. And I talked to him about it, what was going on in Tunisia, and he said it's the same thing in Egypt. And this is the crux of our conversation about it. Just that. Egypt's privatization and structural adjustment programs have led to a brand of crony capitalism. The operative factor is a very sinister cohabitation of power and capital. The structural adjustment program is helping to reconstruct a kind of society where a small number of people own the lion's share of assets. Privatization, in effect, has meant replacing the government monopolies with private monopoly. The middle class has been shrinking while there has been an enlargement of the super rich. State-owned enterprises have been sold to a minority of rich people. The record of private sector enterprises creating jobs is very poor. We're not reaping the benefits of an energetic bourgeoisie. What we have is a parasitical comprador class. The consequences will be no less than catastrophic. This society is a candidate for a difficult period of intense, violent social conflict, and the kind of government we have will not do. The conversation took place around 2009, 2010, just before the Arab Spring. Okay, so moving ahead to the Arab Spring. And we know Tunisia has made wonderful progress in its transition to democracy, with some remaining challenges, but by far the best example and a lot of great progress. Part of what the Arab Spring was about was not just democracy and human rights, dignity and socioeconomic justice. And so the research I'm working on now, part of it is about the economic transitions that are going along with these transitions to or towards democracy. And I did some research and finally I found a vein of research from economists who know the region. And they were talking a lot about, it's not just a democratic transition, it's an economic transition as well. And what would be the best economic transition for the Arab world? And instead of the Washington Consensus, this is their version of what's necessary. They assert that there are really 5 economic transitions that need to take place. 1, you need a developmental state that is capable of implementing an industrial policy. Okay? It's improving the capacities of the state and giving it a role also in fostering industrialization. 2, a productive private sector wean off corruption. 3, a vigorous social policy focused on the young. 4, improved economic relationships with the IFIs, the region, and the world. 5, inclusive socioeconomic policy making. Okay? And their reaction in general was this. After the Arab Spring and recognizing the socioeconomic causes of the Arab Spring, and we have to recall that Tunisia at the time was portrayed as the model for the Washington Consensus, as having the best results. And we found out after the Arab Spring that some of the results weren't, some of the data, information wasn't sound about Tunisia. There was probably more poverty than they were reporting. Unemployment was probably higher. Regional inequality was great. Those kinds of things. So this group of economists argued that the economic reform strategy that Tunisia deserves takes advantage of the opportunities for economic growth provided by global markets and a vigorous private sector, while avoiding the simple-minded application of market liberalization, privatization, and a minimal state that led to crony capitalist forms of authoritarian rule. Okay. Now, since it's been, what, 6 years since the revolution, and how has Tunisia done in regards to these 5 areas? Well, I mean, the developmental state, increasing capacity, a work in progress. The productive private sector, wean off corruption. There are a lot of complaints that the private sector is still corrupt, rent sinking. And there's been a loss of momentum even about trying to get back the money that was stolen during that period. And by the way, I mean, we have some idea of who stole it in Tunisia, and a lot of it, as you know, is the extended family of Ben Ali. And the World Bank even had this accounting of corruption. By the end of 2010, some 220 firms connected to Ben Ali and his extended family were capturing an astounding 21% of all private sector profits annually in Tunisia. A small group of 114 people. Okay, so the efforts to recoup that money from Ben Ali and his family and the cronies related to them has stalled, as far as I can tell. A lot of this is a work in progress, obviously. As I think Qaeda Sepsi, in his government, has suggested that we need to reconcile without continuing to seek that money. We need to move on with our private sector to an extent. I spend most of my days teaching, so I'm keeping day-to-day up on this. Doesn't happen, but you know, in the last year or so, these things are coming out. On the vigorous social policy focused on the young, yes, that's occurring, and a lot of the money, the aid money that's going to Tunisia is probably going to various projects, social policy, helping with job training or various programs to help the young. That's occurring. The institutional development of inclusive socioeconomic policy making, social dialogue and pacts. That's important because what would it do? It would provide an opportunity to obtain a more humane, collaborative, and just capitalism. It would also help the rationality of economic policy because in those dialogues, what can happen is that workers and business employers in the government can have the conversation about expectations. What can be done without ruining the economy? And so that you collaborate on the challenges, you give the people who need it and who participated in a revolution to get it, some concrete advances without them being overwhelming. Right? If you don't do it, what you end up getting is economic policy. It can be sabotaged by strikes, going back and forth. Strikes, money is paid out. And this is what was happening in Tunisia for a while. There was one example, one town, some people, I can't remember what industry they were in. They were striking, and the government answered their demands, and then all the towns around asked for the same thing. So that was not working. So having a national dialogue about this, to move toward a socioeconomic pact seems important. Tunisia in 2012, or I think right at 2012, 2013, they've had a history of national dialogues and social pacts, tripartite under Ben Ali with labor, UDECA, the Economic Association, and the government. And they agreed to form committees, I believe. It was something sort of basic to explore this in 2012, 2013. Then the instability and security, the assassinations happened, and it went to the back burner. Right? After the quartet does the national dialogue that resolves that impasse and gets the Constitution through, and the success of that, the Nobel Prize and so forth, led by the National Labor Federation. People were talking, well, maybe we should do something concretely in the economic realm. This is what we need. And in the last year or so, this has been on the docket. 2016, I think they had it, but we don't know the results yet. It's been, it hasn't gone on long enough. But they did meet, and I think it was under the rubric of an employment dialogue, something more limited. But then it also was different in that political parties participated and civil society. But so that's happening now. The last piece of advice for the economy that Tunisia deserves is back to the IFIs, the international financial institutions. They need a better relationship with Tunisia, and you can tell from what I've been discussing, what's happening in practice on the ground is different from the Washington consensus that the IMF and the World Bank are putting on paper. So the change in relationship needs to also happen with IMF and the World Bank. They have to recognize elite capture. They have to involve civil society so that the policies aren't hijacked to the benefit of a small number, those kinds of things. Is that happening? It isn't. The 2016, there was also an IMF agreement for a loan that went exactly back to the Washington consensus. Austerity, no real social policy, and as the simple-minded application of privatization, free trade, and so forth. So that was happening again and got a bad reaction. The UGT threatened to have a national strike. And there was some debate within the bank, well, maybe we should, instead of unilaterally putting these policies in, we should open it up collaboratively and democratically. So at least they're discussing that. And that's where I think we are. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. And now the floor is open for questions. And I'm going to take the first one.
Okay.
And then I'll pass it on to Gordon. I wanted to ask you about the process. In the first stage, it was changes in the agricultural land ownership. In the second stage, it was austerity. more and the Washington consensus on those measures. So in the third stage, is the emphasis on creating new industries, as you pointed out, and is there a market for those products?
The World Bank and IMF don't seem to be convinced that an industrial policy is necessary. It still doesn't seem to be part of their program. So we're getting the same thing, which by the way, ended up deindustrializing. When you open up too soon or without protection, and it deindustrialized industries in Tunisia, Egypt, in various places. And they're saying the same thing. They're repeating there's no specific industrial policy. And the second part of your question was?
Would there be a market for
the products?
Produced by Tunisia?
Well, yeah, I mean, to take advantage of the opportunities in global capitalism, they need, there was efficient products. If they're competitive, they are. If they're not, they're not.
A particular area where they could be?
I mean, I think an economist who knows, I'm more interested in the politics of it and don't know the exact details of which companies that they should emphasize and where they are on that. I mean, they had a manufacturing base. I mean, regionally, they were known for progress in that direction, but I don't know offhand the details of that.
Maybe a question a little further, and then another question. What is Tunisia's comparative advantage, to use the term economists like? And then my second question was, they have this free trade agreement with Europe and the EU, and had it for some time. What's been the impact of that, and does this work in the Washington consensus direction, or does it work in a more liberalizing direction of after the Arab Spring?
Yeah, when Tunisia was getting the high marks prior to the Arab Spring, I mean, the reports were it was working. I mean, and olive oil and agricultural products were the main things. There was one paper on olive oil-led growth for Tunisia. And so, I mean, the World Bank and they were getting 46 percentage growth rates during that 5-6 year period prior to the Arab Spring, which was good. So, I mean, the numbers weren't all wrong. But moving from that, that's a comparative. I mean, the point about comparative advantage, the East Asian examples where the most progress has happened. We talked about, are their products competitive? Their products became competitive in about a generation. In South Korea under Park.
Because of labor, because of cost of the product, or because of the product?
I mean, they had a development strategy that the World Bank and the IMF don't consider. The East Asian development strategy is a different one. They've done the best, so it should be on the agenda as consideration, but that isn't, because the East Asian model, they have an industrial policy, they have protectionism in order for these industries to get on their feet. I mean, but they have a bureaucracy that's different. I mean, there would have to be great progress in improving the bureaucracies in Tunisia so that they can play the kind of role in industrial policy that they play in East Asia. But I mean, the point is, for Bill's question is evidence seems to suggest a need for a dynamic comparative advantage. And that doesn't seem to be part of the IMF and the World Bank. That, you start with this olive oil-led growth, but eventually you need to get to manufacturing. And you need a bigger role for the state in getting there than they've been willing to consider.
It's an interesting anomaly. I mean, you argue that the products, well, I would argue this way, that the products that Tunisia moved from a government-led oligarchy to a
reliance on corruption, if you will, to survive. Which leads the IMF to suggest that the way to do that is to liberalize further, to get rid of the banking and customs and all the internal regulatory system which favors the oligarchs, to get rid of it, to liberalize it entirely. They can't get that through Parliament. Okay. They absolutely cannot. And so how do you break down the middle class oligarchy, upper middle class oligarchy, if you will? It's totally dependent on government subsidy through its various regulations, not direct subsidy, but indirect subsidy.
Yeah, this modified strategy of this group of economists do talk about that, about deregulation and making the business environment better for all. That's one of their open for all, better and open. I mean, that's one of their recommendations that is to do that. How do you get it done? I mean, there are you know, best practices, and they refer to involving the private sector. I'm thinking now more about the corruption part of it, and no impunity for corruption. If you prosecute the people who've done it, deal with the safe havens abroad where the money's stored, the World Bank and IMF using their leverage to take steps that will prevent elite capture. You know, I mean, it's a work in progress, but that's the directions that they outline.
I guess what I'm saying is corruption goes further than just plain stealing. It goes to rigging the economic system, regulatory system to favor. Right. It's the swamp.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. No, they say deregulate. I mean, that's what the advice is, deregulate. Yeah. Deregulation is a part of this modified economic reform strategy.
Which I take you're not happy with.
No, I'm fine. I accept I accept and I defer to the economists that the best we can do is this modified economic, this modified market reform strategy that doesn't have simple-minded privatization, trade, and the other policies of the Washington Consensus. And so it's not their strategy is for a capitalism that's more compassionate, that works for more. It's a shared growth kind of capitalism. It's an inclusive, democratic change to capitalism. And it's a dynamic look at capitalism where you change from what you're doing within the capitalist economy now to something that gets more benefits over time. But it's still capitalism. Yeah?
It's a tough debate in the sense that the way the Washington Consensus, the real liberal model of deregulation, privatization, so-called free trade, which is a misnomer because in all these trade agreements, there are some areas that are de-tariff and free trade. There are other protectionist aspects in terms of like prime example is prescription drugs and patent extensions and copyright extensions that lead to monopolies over those and really hurt people. So it's not free trade, it's managed trade. And the way that's been applied within power structures is to aid the international elite, globalization, and then local economies, those who are aligned with that kind of dynamic. So what's happened with deregulation is that some businesses are advantaged, others aren't. So it's not really real deregulation. And who's been very hurt by it have been workers and middle class people who the protections that were developed under Bourdieu in this instance, you mentioned the subsidies or the education system or whatever, those are being dismantled under deregulation. privatization has led also to the benefit of certain old private oligarchy billionaires, and that's because it's within the power structure. So the question is, who's got the power? How do you protect the middle class, working class, lower class? I mean, middle classes are entrepreneurs also. How do you build them up? How do you change the power structures to build an economy that benefits the mass of people, not just this global financial system and the private oligarchs? And that's a question for the U.S. too. We're,
yes.
stimulus here and there. The policies in the U.S. are now, especially privatization, deregulation, cutting of government social programs, and it's aiding what's becoming a crony capitalist, but also this capitalist elite.
In terms of
how do you deal with that in terms of power, economic policy, and benefits?
Yeah, I mean, the UJTT, the National Labor Federation, is powerful in Tunisia. And the collaborative, the social dialogue, having the pact, getting people to make a pact that's bringing labor, the employers, government together to address these, to have these conversations. That's, and to come up with policies collaboratively that will help the middle in lower class, and also, you know, the broader economic issues that you're talking about. If we want it to be more shared, it has to be a more inclusive policy making. And Tunisia has scheduled that. They recognize that. And they're bringing people together. I mean, it's just like within the last year or so that they had the pact, and I haven't had a chance to read fully. I know that they're focused on employment, and there were like 11 recommendations. But that's how accepting capitalism, but also dealing with changing the power structures. And some of the economists, the Tunisian economists, with this socioeconomic pact dialogue, they're more worried about labor than they're worried about business. Because politically, labor is so strong, and the labor might have the power to demand enough that you don't solve the broader economic issues. But,
You touched very briefly on regionalism, and I was wondering about what regional stressors there are on this privatization that's concentrated in the hands of the oligarchs. Is there kind of a resistance to regional groups that are trying to participate in this inclusion? Are you getting pressures from migrants, stressors from external groups like Islamic groups coming in? And what are these doing to kind of tear apart this inclusion?
well, the security issues in external groups, that has put socioeconomic dialogue and pact sort of on the back burner. It's one of the things that can get in the way. That's certainly true. I mean, the Arab Spring we ended up not getting the changes that the people who were the economists, when they were writing, they were hoping that you can move to more regional economic cooperation, because across North Africa, it looks like we might get new democratic governments, and you'd have a chance. But we didn't get that. Libya is where it is now in this war, and so the regional piece seems stalled at this point.
If we can talk about this sort of a capitalistic model, a socialistic model, I'm just wondering, has anyone tried to find out the Islamists in Tunisia, are they more inclined to one or the other, or is it just not on their radar?
I mean, I think there's a general point that Islamists tend to favor capitalism and free markets, private enterprises. No, there's more hostility to socialism and the Eastern Bloc and atheism and profitless merchant, and that private property is important. There's in the Tunisian context, the leftist parties and the National Labor Federation they are enemies, more or less, not enemies, but they are in conflict with Ennahda and the Islamists. And so, if anything, more business-oriented to an extent. They've tried to start their own labor federation, the Islamists, and as a reaction to too much power by the more left-leaning National Labor Federation.
We have to stop now, but I want to thank the speaker for a wonderful presentation and to thank you all for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.